The door creaked open slower than George expected. It had been sticking for weeks now, but he hadn't bothered to fix it. The apartment smelled faintly of wood polish and old books, with just a hint of garlic from the pot of spaghetti still simmering on the stove. He'd opened the windows earlier, hoping to air the place out a bit, and even placed a fresh towel over the torn armrest of the recliner. The small table in the corner had been wiped twice. Everything looked clean, even if it wasn't new. He stood by the door in his brown cardigan, smoothing it down nervously as he heard the elevator stop down the hall. His hands trembled, not from age, but from hope. It had been 2 years since Daniel last stepped foot in his home. George had called, texted, left voicemails that went unanswered. Then, last week, a sudden response, "Yeah, we can swing by." Saturday, 7 p.m. And now it was 6:58. The knock was light. Polite. George pulled the door open, smiling wide before he even saw their faces. "Danny," he beamed, voice warm. "Melanie. Come in, come in. It's been too long." Daniel stepped in first, tall, sleek in a navy blue cashmere coat and expensive shoes that clicked loudly on the wooden floor. Melanie followed behind, her hair twisted up, heels immaculate, a designer purse slung over her shoulder like armor. Her eyes flitted around the room, curtains, wallpaper, couch, with a tight, performative smile. "Wow," she said, voice pitched just a little too high. "So vintage." George tried not to notice the way Daniel's lips curled slightly as he looked around. "Same apartment, huh?" Daniel muttered. "Still here," George said. "Rent controlled. Can't beat that, can you?" He laughed softly, but Daniel didn't join in. Neither did Melanie. They stood awkwardly in the small entryway for a moment before George motioned to the table. "Dinner's almost ready. Just have a seat. Make yourselves at home." Daniel hesitated before sitting, wiping the chair with his palm first. Melanie sat down more carefully, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. George turned back toward the kitchen. "I made your mom's recipe. Spaghetti with mushroom marinara. You remember that, right?" He didn't hear a response, just a whisper, quiet, sharp. "I told you it'd be like this," Melanie muttered, not realizing George's hearing was still sharper than they thought. "He still lives like he's on a janitor's paycheck." Daniel chuckled. "What did you expect? He probably hasn't bought new furniture since I left for college." George stopped stirring. His hands stiffened around the wooden spoon. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, eyes staring into the steam rising from the pot. Still lives like a janitor. That word used to mean something to George. It meant dignity. Hard work. He used to mop school hallways at 4 a.m. so Daniel could sleep in a warm bed. Worked the night shift at a hospital so his wife's chemo bills could be paid on time. His knees hurt now because he never took a sick day. But to his son, janitor was something to whisper with shame. He swallowed hard and stirred the sauce again, just long enough to collect himself. When he brought the food over, they were already checking their phones. Melanie barely looked up as he placed her plate down. Daniel muttered a distracted thanks. They picked at their food like they were at a child's play kitchen, not at their father's dinner table. George sat across from them, smiling tightly. "So, tell me about your place downtown. I've seen pictures online. Looks fancy." Daniel leaned back a little. "Yeah, we just renovated again. Had the kitchen redone. Granite everything. And Melanie put in these imported tiles from Spain. What were they, honey?" "Hand-painted," Melanie said, dabbing her mouth with a napkin she'd brought from her purse. "We had to wait 3 months for the order. Worth it though." George nodded. "Sounds beautiful." Melanie looked around again. "You know, you could really do something with this place. A coat of paint, new furniture. Maybe even rip out the carpet?" George chuckled softly. "Well, I'm not here much these days." Melanie blinked. "Where else would you be?" He hesitated. "I like to walk a lot. Parks, libraries. That sort of thing. Daniel rolled his eyes. Still avoiding technology, huh? You know you can do everything from your phone now, right? Banking, groceries, even therapy. George smiled gently. Some things I prefer to do the old way. Melanie's phone buzzed, and she picked it up immediately, ignoring George's next sentence. Daniel leaned over and looked at the screen. Sorry, Melanie said, still staring at it. My assistant just sent over our itinerary for Bali. We're flying out next week. Did we tell you? Daniel's closing a deal with this massive tech firm over there. No, you didn't mention that, George said quietly. Melanie smiled. Well, it's pretty big. VIP stuff. First class all the way. Sounds exciting, George said, pushing a meatball gently with his fork. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. You ever think about traveling, Dad? I mean, if you're not spending much, maybe you've saved up a little. You could upgrade your life a bit. George tilted his head. Upgrade it to what? Daniel smirked. You know what I mean. George set down his fork. Actually, no. I don't. Melanie crossed her legs and leaned back. Well, no offense, but this isn't exactly how we thought you'd be living. I mean, after all this time. You were always so smart with your hands, Dad. George looked at his son. Do you think I'm poor? The question stunned them. For a second, no one spoke. I mean, Daniel began, shrugging, you live in a rent-controlled unit. You drive a '98 Corolla. You cook your own food. You wear slippers with holes in them. Melanie laughed, trying to stifle it behind her napkin. George nodded slowly. I see. He stood up quietly and began collecting the plates. I'm sorry if the place didn't meet your expectations. Melanie raised an eyebrow. Don't be so sensitive, George. We're just saying you deserve more. I have more than I need, he replied. Daniel sighed, annoyed. You always say that. But that kind of mindset is why you're stuck. George turned around and faced him. Stuck where? In this life. The air turned cold. Not from temperature, but from truth. George stared at his son for a long moment, his suit, his expensive watch, the way he held himself like the world owed him applause. I'm glad you came, George said, voice low. Even if it was just to remind me why I live the way I do. Daniel scoffed. That makes no sense. No, George said. It doesn't. Not to you. George stood still for a moment, gripping the empty plates in his hands as Daniel leaned back in his chair like he was waiting for dessert in a restaurant he'd already given a poor review. The spaghetti on their plates remained mostly untouched, cold by now. Melanie was now back on her phone, texting with one perfectly manicured hand and sipping water with the other. She barely noticed the tension, or maybe she did and simply didn't care. After all, what tension could come from a man who lives like a janitor? George slowly turned, walked toward the kitchen, and placed the plates in the sink with care. Not because they were valuable, they were chipped, mismatched ceramic, but because they were the same ones he'd shared meals with his wife and son on for over 2 decades. His wife had once said, things don't have to match to hold meaning. He had never replaced them. From the kitchen, he could still hear their voices, low and careless. Melanie whispered, I mean, what's he even doing with his time? Sitting here in this dusty place, watering plants and watching old shows? This is kind of depressing. Daniel chuckled softly. He's always been like this. Stuck in his bubble. Never wanted more. George kept his back to them, hands resting on the edge of the sink. His knuckles were white. He had heard them. Every word. But he didn't flinch. Not yet. Instead, he looked out the window. The sky was dimming into an amber glow. Across the street, the neighbor's dog barked as someone walked past. In the distance, a siren wailed. Just normal city sounds. Just a normal evening in the apartment he'd called home for 42 years. He returned to the table. "I made some tea," he said. "Would you like some?" Daniel blinked. Sure." Melanie declined with a forced smile. "I don't do caffeine this late. It bloats me." George poured Daniel a cup and sat back down slowly, his knees protesting the way they always did. He took his own cup in hand, but didn't drink. He stared at the steam curling up, then spoke without looking at them. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what kind of life someone's lived by the time they're 75? Daniel gave a half-hearted shrug. "I guess." George sipped his tea. "I think about it a lot. Especially when people assume they already know the answer just by looking at the walls." There was an uncomfortable pause. Melanie adjusted her seat. "We didn't mean anything by earlier. We just think you deserve more. That's all." George looked at her, calm but unreadable. "You think I'm still living like this because I didn't deserve more?" No, not what I meant," she said quickly. "Just that you could have had more." George nodded. Had more." Daniel sighed, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Dad, look. We're not judging you. We just worry, okay? You're getting older. This place isn't exactly safe. If something happened, I'd be fine," George cut in gently. "But..." George's tone remained steady. "I didn't invite you here for a lecture. I invited you for dinner." Daniel swallowed hard. "Okay. Sorry." George studied his son for a moment, the suit, the posture, the guarded expression. Then he turned to Melanie. "I remember when Daniel was 10, he said. He used to come home with holes in his shoes because he played too rough on the pavement. I patched them up with duct tape and cardboard. He hated it, but I couldn't afford new ones every month. I still remember the day he came home crying because a kid at school called him garbage feet." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "You remember that, don't you, son?" He didn't answer. Just nodded faintly. George continued, voice low but steady. "I worked the night shift at a parking garage that year. And a janitorial gig at the hospital during the day. Slept 4 hours a night. Just enough time to cook dinner and help you with math. Still, somehow, you always got new shoes at the start of every semester." Daniel looked down at the table. "You don't remember those things," George said. "But I do. Every minute of it." The room fell completely silent. George finished his tea in one slow sip and stood again. "I'll get dessert." "No, it's fine," Melanie started, but George was already walking toward the kitchen. This time, he didn't stop at the stove or the fridge. He walked past the counter, around the corner of the kitchen, and into the short hallway that led to his bedroom. The door creaked open. Inside was a simple twin bed, a wooden chair, and a bookshelf. No television. No clutter. But there was one thing that didn't fit, a heavy oak cabinet against the far wall. George closed the door behind him. He stared at the cabinet for a long time. With a small grunt, he crouched and reached beneath it, grabbing the hidden panel just beneath the wood lip. With one swift motion, he slid it out of place, revealing the metal face of an embedded safe. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Just the sight of it was enough to remind him of everything: 27 years of savings, investment gains, cautious cash dealings. No banks. Just tangible stacks, collected slowly, protected fiercely. $8 million. Hidden in a janitor's apartment. He sat on the bed for a while, listening to the muffled voices in the next room. Melanie was talking again, now about some resort in Bali. Daniel was laughing again, too loud for someone who didn't bring a single birthday card. George didn't feel sad anymore. He felt something else. Tired, yes, but also clear. Very, very clear. He opened the safe, not fully, just enough to make sure everything was still intact. It was. Then he closed it, slid the panel back into place, and returned to the dining room. "Sorry," he said. "I forgot I already ate dessert earlier." That's okay, Daniel said, checking his watch. Actually, we should probably head out soon anyway. Traffic and all. Melanie stood up, brushing non-existent dust from her dress. Thanks for having us, George. George smiled. Of course. Daniel stepped forward and patted his father's shoulder like he was greeting a doorman. You take care, all right? Maybe next time we'll have you over. You'll love our rooftop garden. I'm sure I will, George replied softly. As he closed the door behind them, he stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the knob. He didn't feel small. They did. They just didn't know it yet. The hallway fell quiet again. George turned, walked back into his apartment, and sat down at the now empty table. He placed his hands flat on the surface. Then, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself a bitter smile. George sat at the table, still facing the two empty chairs across from him, even though Daniel and Melanie had long since gone. The plates were cold, the air was still, and the hum of the refrigerator in the background sounded louder than ever. The chair Daniel had sat in was pulled slightly back, just like his son always used to do, leaning back like the world was beneath him. Melanie's cloth napkin was still folded neatly on her untouched plate, lipstick marking the rim of her water glass. Everything about their visit had been clean, calculated, and cold. George reached forward and quietly took their dishes to the sink. He rinsed them carefully, not because he had to, but because he was used to doing things right, even when no one was looking. As the warm water ran over the chipped porcelain, his eyes drifted to the small magnet on the fridge. It held an old photo, Daniel as a child, maybe 7 years old, sitting on George's shoulders at the county fair, both of them laughing. He reached up, pulled the photo off gently, and stared at it. He was still staring when the clock on the wall struck 9 p.m. The chimes echoed through the small apartment. Slow. Hollow. 9 chimes. August 3rd. George's birthday. He hadn't told them. He never did. But Daniel knew. At least, he used to. George walked to the drawer in the hallway and pulled it open. Inside were envelopes, stamps, utility bills, and a faded birthday card. It was from 5 years ago. The last one Daniel had ever sent. Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you're doing well. Let's catch up soon. There was no love, Daniel. No phone call that year either. Just the card. George sat back down at the table with it in his hand. He read it again and again, as if somewhere between the lines there might be some hint of the boy he once knew. The one who used to build Lego towers on this very floor. The one who once cried when George missed his school play because of a double shift. The one who used to wait by the window for him to come home late at night with a leftover donut in his pocket. What had happened to that boy? What had George done wrong? He knew the answer. He had raised a son in a world obsessed with image and forgotten to show him that value was built in silence. In sacrifice. In meals cooked quietly and shoes patched with cardboard. He'd given Daniel everything except the ability to see what mattered. And tonight, for the first time, George didn't just feel forgotten. He felt small. Not because of the apartment. Not because of the clothes or the broken recliner or the outdated wallpaper. But because his only son had sat across from him for 2 hours, and not once said the words. Happy birthday. The ache in George's chest was heavier than he expected. Not sharp. Not loud. Just deep. Like a heavy stone dropped into a well and swallowed by silence. He stood slowly and walked to the cabinet in the corner of the room. The one near the wall. The one with the hidden truth behind it. His fingers moved with the ease of habit, sliding the wooden lip, pressing the small latch, opening the panel. The steel safe stood silently, embedded into the wall like a heart buried under bone. He opened it. Rows of cash stared back at him. Bundles of hundreds, wrapped tight. Documents. Deeds. Notes. A lifetime of earnings earned by hands that cleaned floors, scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans, and changed bedpans. $8 million. And no one knew. Not the banks. Not the neighbors. Not even Daniel. George didn't care about the number. He never had. He had only cared about what it represented: freedom, integrity, sacrifice. And now, tonight, as he sat in a $500 recliner that creaked, wearing $10 slippers with thinning soles, George realized something. They had never seen him. Not truly. He was just the backdrop to Daniel's success story. A character in a narrative Daniel told at parties. My dad raised me alone in some old apartment. Can you believe that? Guy never even had a smartphone. But I made it out. That was who he was to them. Not a father. Not a man. A footnote. George sat back and stared at the safe. At the bills he could burn and never feel the loss. And slowly, an idea began to form. Not revenge. Not exactly. But something colder. Smarter. Something that would make them stop. And look. And see him. Not as a janitor. Not as a burden. But as a man they should have never underestimated. He closed the safe gently, slid the panel back into place, and walked back to the kitchen. He pulled out his old phone, no fingerprint scanner, no Face ID, just buttons and a scratched screen. He dialed a number. A woman's voice answered. Claire Richards, Estate Law. Claire, it's George Callahan. There was a pause, then warmth. George. It's been a while. Happy birthday, by the way. George smiled faintly. You remembered. Of course I did. You're one of the few clients who doesn't call me just to yell about taxes. George chuckled. Well, I do have something I want to talk to you about. Go on. I want to make some changes to my will. And I want to start transferring things quietly. Can we meet this week? A pause. Then, absolutely. Same place? George nodded. Tuesday. Noon. You got it. And George? Yes? You okay? He hesitated. No, he said quietly. But I will be. He hung up and sat in the silence again. On the table, next to the half-full cup of tea, was a candle. Just one. He had pulled it out that morning without thinking. Now he lit it. Not for celebration. But for memory. He closed his eyes, the soft flicker dancing across his face, and whispered to no one. Happy birthday, old man. Tuesday came fast. The sky was gray that morning, not stormy, just quietly overcast, as if the world knew George's mood and had chosen to match it. He buttoned his shirt slowly, one button off at first, then corrected it. He wore his only decent coat, the brown one with the faded collar. The same coat he'd worn to his wife's funeral. The same coat he wore when Daniel graduated. It still fit. By 11:15 a.m., George had locked up the apartment and caught the 22A bus heading into Midtown. No one noticed him. No one ever really did. And George preferred it that way. He carried a canvas tote bag under his arm, the kind they give out at local libraries. Inside it, 2 folders, one red and one black. The red one contained scanned deeds, purchase records, and a long list of investments dating back 30 years. Some in stocks. Some in physical property. A few in things even Daniel would have considered smart money. All tucked away quietly. All off the radar. The black folder held his will and the updates he planned to make. At exactly 11:58 a.m., George stepped into the quiet marble lobby of a small office building on 47th Street and took the elevator to the 6th floor. The office door read. Claire Richards, Estate Law and Legacy Planning. She was waiting with 2 cups of coffee already on the table. George, Claire said with a soft smile. Still early. Still punctual. George smiled back. Couldn't disappoint you. She reached out and hugged him briefly. Happy birthday, late. I brought you the good coffee. Not the machine stuff. He chuckled, then took a seat. Thank you. They sat in silence for a moment before Claire glanced at the folders. So, is this what I think it is? George tapped the red folder. This is the truth. And the other one? He leaned in. That's the legacy I want to leave behind. But not yet. Not all of it. Claire nodded, opening the black folder. Okay. Walk me through what you're thinking. George spoke quietly but firmly. I want to restructure the will. Daniel, my son, he'll get something. But not blindly. Not all of it. And definitely not without proving something first. Claire listened closely, taking notes. And the rest? I want most of it going to the Callahan Community Fund. In Evelyn's name. For working-class scholarships, emergency healthcare, housing. Things that actually matter. Claire looked up. Your late wife? George nodded, eyes distant. She always said, help people who don't have anyone to lean on. Be their someone. She'd want this. Claire smiled softly. She'd be proud. He continued. And I want everything secure. No changes unless I approve them personally. Daniel and his wife, they might try to challenge this. Claire raised an eyebrow. You think they'll push back? George sighed. I don't just think it. I know it. Meanwhile, across town, in a sleek high-rise overlooking the city, Daniel poured himself a glass of whiskey at noon. He wasn't working today. Instead, he was pacing. Melanie sat on the couch with her laptop open, scrolling through vacation rentals in Tuscany. She wasn't paying attention to the conversation, not fully. Not until Daniel said something that made her stop. He's hiding something. Melanie looked up. What? My dad. The money. She tilted her head. You think he has more? Daniel nodded slowly. When he pulled out that stack from the wall, he was too calm. Too casual. You don't keep that kind of money in your wall unless it's just the tip of something bigger. Melanie's eyes narrowed. Then what do we do? Daniel sipped his drink. We visit again. We play nice. And we figure out how much there really is. Melanie smiled slowly. Then what? Daniel grinned, cold. Then we make sure it's ours. Back in the apartment that night, George stood by the cabinet again. He looked at the wall. At the space behind it that had hidden everything he'd ever built. The idea had started as a safety precaution. When Evelyn was sick, George had pulled what little they had out of the banks after one institution froze his account for 48 hours over a technical error. It nearly cost her a treatment session. From then on, George decided he wouldn't trust anyone else with what mattered. He had stored it all himself. Hidden it. Guarded it. Built it in silence. He moved slowly now, sliding the cabinet just enough to reach the hidden panel. He tapped the latch 3 times, click, click, click. Then it released. The safe revealed itself like a secret finally exhaling. George opened it. Cash. Legal documents. Property keys. A metal box with the deed to a small plot of land in Vermont, a place he'd considered retiring to before deciding he didn't want to die somewhere cold and alone. He ran his fingers over the rows of bundled bills. This was not revenge money. It was survival. It was love. It was quiet dignity turned tangible. He never meant to use it to prove a point. But maybe now it was time. Not to punish Daniel. But to wake him up. George closed the safe and slid the cabinet back in place. Then he picked up his notepad. He began writing something simple. Dear Daniel. There are things you don't know about me. Not because I hid them to be cruel. But because you never asked. He paused. Then flipped to the next page and began again. The next morning, George stood in line at the post office. He wasn't sending anything yet. Just buying a special lockbox and a prepaid envelope. He mailed it to his lawyer, with instructions. Everything was in motion now. He went home and sat down with a sigh. He stared at the door. And waited. Sure enough, at 6:13 p.m., there was a knock. He opened it slowly, already knowing who it would be. Daniel stood there, Melanie by his side. Smiling. Too brightly. "Hey, Dad," Daniel said. "Hope it's not too late. We were in the neighborhood." "Hope it's not too late," Daniel said again, his voice casual, smooth. Too smooth. George stepped aside without a word. Melanie kissed him lightly on the cheek as she walked in. "You look great, George. That coat suits you." It was the same coat he'd worn 3 days ago. The one they hadn't even noticed then. But now, suddenly, it suited him. George didn't respond to the compliment. He simply nodded and motioned toward the chairs. "Have a seat." The room was the same. Still dim. Still small. Still filled with the scent of old wood and soft silence. But something had shifted. George had changed. Not on the outside, but inside. He wasn't playing defense anymore. He sat across from them and rested his hands lightly on his knees. No tea. No dinner. No friendly small talk. Just stillness. "So," George said, "what brings you by?" Daniel leaned forward. "We've been thinking a lot since the other night. About you. About the money. About your future." Melanie jumped in, smiling. "And we just feel like it's time to start talking about options. Planning. You know, like a long-term vision for your security." George raised an eyebrow. "Security?" Daniel nodded quickly. "Yeah. Look, Dad, you're not getting any younger. This place is fine, sure. But it's not safe. You don't even have a security system." George tilted his head. "Never needed one." Melanie leaned in now. "You might not need one. But someone else might want what you have." George gave her a long, cool look. There it was. She was trying to scare him. Trying to push just enough fear into the room to make her next words sound helpful instead of hungry. "I've gotten by just fine," George replied calmly. Daniel smiled, too fast. "But you shouldn't just get by. You should thrive. And you can. Especially now that we know you have resources." George said nothing. Daniel continued. "So we've been talking to someone. A friend of mine who does financial management for people in your situation." George raised an eyebrow. "People in my situation?" "Older," Daniel clarified quickly. "People who've kept their wealth private." Melanie reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "This is a trust setup proposal. Power of attorney. All perfectly legal, completely secure. You wouldn't have to do anything. Just sign it and let us take care of the rest. Stress-free." She slid it across the table. George didn't touch it. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied the two of them as if seeing them for the first time. "How long have you two been planning this?" Daniel blinked. "Planning what?" "This," George said. He nodded toward the folder. "Coming in here pretending to care. Dropping hints. Talking about security and stress and options." Melanie sat up straighter. "That's not fair, George." George's voice remained even. "Let's stop pretending. You didn't come here because you're worried about me. You came here because you saw a glimpse of something and now you want to own it." Daniel looked offended. "Dad, that's not." "I'm not stupid," George cut in sharply. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't raised. But it was suddenly so firm that the entire room seemed to still. "I've spent my whole life being quiet. I never needed to be loud. I worked when others slept. Saved while others spent. Sacrificed when no one was watching. And now I see the price of all that silence. He leaned forward, slowly, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. You think I lived small because I didn't know better. But I chose this life. Melanie tried to laugh it off. You don't have to prove anything to us. George didn't smile. But you need me to. Don't you? Silence. You need me to justify what I've built, he said. Because it bothers you that I could live so simply, and still have more than either of you ever will. Daniel looked down. George stood now, slow but steady. He walked to the far wall, the one behind the cabinet. He stopped and turned. You see this apartment and feel pity, he said. But this place holds every chapter of your childhood. Every memory. Every night I stayed awake listening for your cough when you were sick. Every time your mother cried in the dark, thinking you wouldn't go to college. Every dollar that went into your tuition came from these floors, these walls, these hands. He held them up. Calloused. Worn. Real. Now you sit here and ask me to hand over everything to make your lives easier? He walked back to the table and looked at the folder. Then he picked it up and slowly tore it in half, once, twice, until the pages were nothing but a crumpled mess. He dropped them on the table. Melanie stood up abruptly. That was incredibly rude, George. We came here to help. No, George said. You came here to take. Daniel stood, voice tense now. You don't trust us? George turned slowly toward him. I trusted you the day I put on a second pair of socks because I couldn't afford heat and still made sure you had a winter coat. I trusted you every time I let you eat the last piece of meat while I finished dinner with just rice. I trusted you when I handed over the keys to your first car and told you, go be better than me. His voice cracked just slightly. I did trust you. Daniel's jaw clenched. So what now? You cut me out? You think I don't deserve anything? George walked to the cabinet and paused. He looked back at his son. You'll get what you deserve, he said softly. But not what you expect. Melanie's tone turned cold. So that's it, then? George looked at her. You never knew what it was to begin with. They left minutes later, slamming the door harder than necessary. George stood alone in the silence once again. But this time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. That night, George didn't open the safe. He didn't need to. He opened the black folder instead, his will in progress, and began writing a new section. One that read, My son will not inherit based on blood. He will inherit based on character. If he learns what truly matters, he will find the path I've left for him. If he doesn't, he was never meant to carry this legacy. He signed it. And for the first time in years, he slept deeply. No noise. No worry. Just peace. The elevator doors closed before Melanie even spoke. Daniel stood in silence beside her, his jaw tight, hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. He was chewing the inside of his cheek like he used to when he was scolded as a kid. But Melanie, her eyes were cold, calculating, unmoved. Are you going to say something? She finally asked. Daniel didn't look at her. What do you want me to say? That your father just humiliated both of us, she snapped. Tore up a legal agreement like it was junk mail. Accused us of using him. Do you think we're just going to walk away after that? He's stubborn, Daniel muttered. Always has been. He'll calm down. Melanie scoffed. That wasn't stubborn. That was deliberate. He's holding something back. And you saw it. Daniel didn't answer. But she was right. He had seen it. The confidence in George's face. The way he stood taller, firmer. The way he looked directly into Daniel's eyes and spoke with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who knows they hold the upper hand. George hadn't just saved a little money over the years. He had something big. And he was hiding it. We have to go back, Melanie said firmly. Daniel turned. What, again? We just left. Exactly. He'll think we gave up. That's when we come in nice and soft. Just a visit. No pressure. No questions. Daniel narrowed his eyes. You're playing him. I'm doing what you won't, she snapped. We gave that man everything: respect, dinner, conversation, help, and he spat in our faces. Don't you get it? If we don't do this now, he's going to leave all of it to some charity or a cat shelter or a library. Daniel rubbed his forehead. He's not that kind of man. You sure? Melanie asked. Daniel looked away. He wasn't. 2 days later, George was sitting by the window in his living room, a book in his lap but unread. His thoughts were with Evelyn. She would have loved this weather, cloudy but warm, the kind of quiet afternoon that asked for black coffee and soft jazz. He reached up and touched the wedding ring still hanging from a thin chain around his neck. It had never come off since the day she died. The knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, there they were. Again. Daniel held a small white bag. Hey, Dad. We brought you something. George stepped aside without a word, lips pressed into a neutral line. Melanie smiled, too wide. We thought we'd surprise you. No talk of money, we promise. Daniel handed over the bag. It's lemon loaf. From that cafe on 9th you used to take me to. George took the bag slowly. It closed 3 years ago. Daniel's smile faltered. Oh. Well, we found another one. Same recipe. George turned to the kitchen. I'll make tea. They followed him and like cats pretending not to stalk. George moved slowly, his hands steady, but his thoughts spun. Why were they back? He hadn't called. Hadn't written. Hadn't even replied to Daniel's one text, "We need to talk." He poured water into the kettle and set it to boil. Melanie leaned against the counter, watching him. I was thinking, she said. Maybe we could go through some old photos together. You must have albums. George didn't turn around. I have a few. I'd love to see them. I bet you've got some real treasures packed away in here. George's hand paused just a second too long as he reached for the teacups. She noticed. He saw it in her eyes. She was hunting. Daniel joined in. And I wanted to help you go through Mom's things. You said her jewelry's still here. I'd love to keep something for memory's sake. George turned now, very slowly. My wife's jewelry hasn't been touched in years. I know, Daniel said quickly. And I'm not trying to take it. Just, maybe hold on to one piece. Something that reminds me of her. George studied him. Do you remember what her favorite ring looked like? Daniel blinked. Melanie interrupted. It had a blue stone, right? Sapphire? George didn't respond. He turned back to the kettle and clicked it off just before it screamed. 20 minutes later, the three of them sat in the living room. George sipped his tea. Daniel pretended to enjoy the lemon loaf. Melanie asked questions, endless, casual, dangerous. Do you still have that safe deposit box? The one from the bank? George took another sip. I canceled it. Really, she said lightly. Isn't it risky keeping everything here? George's eyes didn't move. Who said I keep everything here? Daniel let out a nervous chuckle. We just assume. I mean, the money you showed us. I showed you nothing, George replied evenly. Just enough to make you curious. Melanie leaned forward. So it was a test. George nodded. And you failed. The room went completely silent. Daniel put his cup down slowly. Dad, come on. That's not fair. We came here just to spend time with you. George's voice was low. Measured. No, you came here hoping I'd open a door I already locked. Melanie stood up, her voice rising slightly. You think we're thieves? No, George said calmly. I think you're scared. She froze. George stood now, too, and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled out a photo album and placed it on the table between them. It was old, cracked leather, heavy with years. "Here," he said. "You want to know who I am? Start there." Melanie hesitated. Daniel opened it. The first page, George in a hospital uniform, holding a mop. Smiling. Next page, George and Evelyn holding baby Daniel. Poor but happy. Then, George on a ladder, fixing a neighbor's roof. A note scribbled underneath in Evelyn's handwriting, "He never says no." Photo after photo, George working, building, helping. One after another, evidence of a life lived in sacrifice. By the 10th page, Melanie's face was tight. Daniel closed the album. "I get it," he muttered. "No," George replied. "You don't." He turned to Melanie. "And neither do you." She folded her arms. "So what's your plan, George? Keep all your money until you die? Let it rot in some hole in the wall?" George looked at her, then at Daniel. "I'm not keeping it from me," he said. "I'm keeping it from people who only see it as numbers." Daniel stood up, frustrated. "So who gets it then?" George answered with steel in his voice. "The people who understand what it took to earn it." That night, George moved the rest of the money. Every last bill. He had hired a private courier 2 days ago, after their last visit. The man showed up at midnight. Quiet. Discreet. No questions asked. The steel briefcases left his apartment in the dark. By morning, the safe was empty. But the wall remained untouched. Just in case. The next time they came, George didn't even ask why. He knew. They knocked at exactly 4 p.m. on a Sunday, the same hour Evelyn used to bake banana bread while humming under her breath. It used to be his favorite day of the week. Now it just tasted like suspicion. George opened the door slowly. Daniel smiled first. "Hey, Dad. Smells good." "I haven't cooked yet," George replied. Melanie stepped in behind him, holding a bottle of wine. "We brought you something. Thought maybe we could have dinner. Just the 3 of us." George took the bottle without looking at the label. "I don't drink." "Oh," Melanie said, clearly already knowing that. "Right." They followed him into the living room. The apartment looked exactly the same as before, but something had shifted. George had stopped playing the game. But they hadn't. "I'm making stew," George said. "Just got it simmering." Melanie perked up. "Need help in the kitchen?" "No," he said. "I don't need help." She laughed awkwardly. Okay. Just offering." George motioned toward the couch. "Make yourselves comfortable." As he turned away, he caught it again, that flicker in her eyes. That flicker he had seen last time. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. The stove clicked on. The pot was already filled with beef, onions, and potatoes. Simple, hearty food. He stirred slowly, the spoon moving in smooth, practiced circles. His ears, however, were tuned in a different direction. Behind him, soft footsteps. Not Daniel. He remained in the living room, flipping through a newspaper that George had left out on purpose, yesterday's edition, folded to an article about real estate fraud. No, the footsteps were hers. Light. Sneaky. Melanie. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He heard the faint creak of the hallway floorboard near the bathroom. Then the soft brush of fabric against the doorframe. Then his bedroom door opening. Click. George continued stirring. The stew bubbled. The apartment was filled with the smell of garlic, thyme, and something else. Control. He didn't rush. Didn't call out. He let her think she was unseen. Unheard. He turned the burner down low, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked back to the living room where Daniel sat pretending to read. "She needed the bathroom?" George asked. Daniel looked up, startled. Yeah. George nodded. Second door on the left, right? Daniel added quickly. George didn't reply. Instead, he walked past him, toward the hallway. Silently. In the bedroom, Melanie was crouched low, rummaging through drawers. She wasn't being reckless, she was being surgical. She opened only the bottom drawers, the ones old men rarely use. She pulled back socks, shirts, old books. Nothing. She moved to the closet. Behind the coats, the cardboard boxes. One of them was marked tools. She opened it. A hammer. Screws. An old wrench. Dust. Then she froze. The wall. The cabinet was pushed snug against it, but the floorboards around it were slightly scuffed, newer than the others. She touched the edges. There was a gap. Barely visible, but there. Melanie's pulse quickened. She reached behind the cabinet, trying to find a latch or handle, something. Looking for something? She jumped. George stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Her hand froze mid-air. I was just, she began, already backing away. George stepped into the room slowly. You thought I wouldn't hear you? I was looking for the bathroom, she stammered. I got turned around. George looked at the cabinet, then back at her. The bathroom has a mirror. That doesn't explain why you were behind my furniture. Melanie straightened up. You're being paranoid. No, George said softly. I'm being clear. Melanie held his gaze. You don't trust your own family? George walked past her, pulled the cabinet out slightly, and revealed the wooden panel behind it. Then he reached out and opened it. Empty. Nothing inside. Melanie's jaw dropped slightly. It was, here, wasn't it? George nodded. It was. Melanie's face changed. No longer embarrassed. Now angry. Ashamed. You moved it, she whispered. George nodded again. Melanie stepped forward. Where is it? That's none of your concern. You have no right to keep it from Daniel, she snapped. He's your son. And yet, George said, voice quiet and calm, he hasn't asked me one question that wasn't about what he could take. Back in the living room, Daniel sat frozen as George re-entered with Melanie behind him. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips tight. Let's eat, George said simply. The stew was served silently. No one spoke during the meal. Daniel pushed the food around with his spoon. Melanie chewed like it was rubber. George ate calmly, every bite deliberate. At one point, Melanie set down her spoon and said, You don't get to control everything forever, you know. George looked at her. Don't I? Daniel finally spoke. Dad, this is getting ridiculous. We came here to be with you. No, George replied. You came here because you believe I owe you something. Daniel looked offended. I'm your only son. You're not acting like it. Silence. George stood again and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled out a thick envelope and placed it on the table. Daniel reached for it, but George stopped him with a look. This is not what you think it is, he said. Daniel hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside, a copy of his college tuition records. Receipts from Evelyn's hospital bills. A note from the school saying Daniel's tuition had been paid in full by George Callahan. Even the down payment receipt for Daniel's first car, one Daniel believed he'd earned through a part-time job. George sat down. I built your life with my hands, he said. And you looked me in the eyes and saw a man beneath you. Daniel was stunned. George looked at Melanie. And you looked at me and saw a fool. A weak, lonely old man. Melanie's eyes burned. George's voice lowered. But you forgot the most dangerous kind of man is the one with nothing left to lose, and nothing left to prove. They left quickly after that. No fake smiles. No goodbye hugs. Just silence, the door clicking shut behind them. George stood by the wall. Not the wall with the safe, because it was empty now. But the one with the framed photo of Evelyn. He looked up at her. "I see it now," he whispered. "You were right. They never saw me. But now they will." He reached into the drawer and pulled out a fresh envelope. This time, it wasn't tuition receipts. It was a new letter to his lawyer. And this time, it contained instructions for something permanent. 3 days passed. George didn't call them. Didn't text. Didn't leave a message. But they came anyway. Of course they did. Not because they missed him. Not because they were sorry. They came because curiosity had now become desperation. George had given them silence, and in silence, their minds had begun to spiral. What if he had more than just money? What if he had properties? Offshore accounts? Gold bars? And worst of all, what if he had already given it to someone else? Daniel knocked at 7 p.m. sharp. Melanie stood beside him, dressed more modestly this time. No flashy jewelry. No designer bag. Just soft tones, a subtle cardigan. A costume meant to say, "We're humble now. We understand you." George opened the door and gave them a look neither welcoming nor cold. Just unreadable. "Come in," he said simply. No smile. No handshake. No warmth. They followed him into the apartment. It looked exactly the same. Same lamp. Same recliner. Same curtain with the small tear near the edge. But the atmosphere was different. Like a storm cloud had settled in the middle of the room and refused to move. George motioned to the couch. "Sit." They obeyed. George sat in the chair across from them and rested his hands on the arms slowly, like a judge ready to hear a case. Daniel was the first to speak. "Dad, we want to apologize." George didn't blink. Daniel cleared his throat. "The other night, we crossed a line. Melanie shouldn't have gone into your room. I shouldn't have let this all get so ugly." Melanie nodded. "You've always been good to us. And we took that for granted." George said nothing. So they kept going. "We want to rebuild that trust," Daniel said. "But we also, well, we wanted to be honest. You showed us something. That cash. It was shocking, yes, but also inspiring. We realized you've done more than we ever imagined. And that made us curious." George finally leaned forward. "Curious about what?" Daniel hesitated. Melanie answered. "About your legacy." George tilted his head. "Legacy. We're not asking for anything," she added quickly. "But if there's anything you've built, anything you want to leave behind, we want to be part of it. To protect it. Honor it." George looked down at his hands. Then he stood up. He walked to the corner of the room and reached behind the bookshelf. Click. The latch gave way. He opened the panel. Inside, bundles of cash. Stacks of $100 bills. Organized. Neat. Unmistakable. Melanie gasped audibly. Daniel leaned forward like he was about to leap from his chair. George didn't say a word. He reached inside and pulled out just one bundle. He placed it on the table in front of them. Daniel stared at it like it was glowing. "Dad." George looked at him sharply. "This," he said, "is 1%. Melanie's mouth parted slightly. "Of the total?" George nodded. Daniel swallowed hard. "And the rest?" "Is where it belongs," George said. "Safe. Untouchable. Until I decide what to do." He looked at them both. "But tonight, I want to hear something from you." Daniel looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I want you," George said slowly, "to tell me what legacy means to you." They exchanged a quick look. Melanie spoke first. "Legacy is building something that lasts. That outlives you. It's about family. About ensuring your children have what they need to carry your name forward. Daniel nodded, echoing her. It's about making your sacrifices mean something. Passing down what matters. George studied them. What matters? He asked. Daniel smiled. Your values. Melanie added, your strength. Your discipline. George held back the bitter chuckle rising in his throat. He wanted to say, where was that respect when you whispered about me living like a janitor? Where was that reverence when you broke into my room, pawing through my drawers like a thief in designer shoes? But he said none of that. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a key. It was old. Brass. Simple. He placed it next to the bundle of cash. This is for the safe deposit box I reopened, George said. It has a letter. Instructions. And documents. Daniel's hands twitched. George leaned forward slightly. If something happens to me, you'll know what to do. But not before. Melanie's eyes narrowed slightly. You're trusting us with it? George nodded. I'm giving you a test. One last chance to earn what you're asking for. Daniel picked up the key, carefully. As if touching gold. What happens if we pass? You'll find out, George said. Melanie's voice was soft now. Calculated. And if we fail? George smiled, just barely. You already did once. Later that night, after they left, Daniel held the key in his hand the entire car ride home. Melanie sat in silence beside him, but he could feel her energy. Coiled. Hungry. Do you think he's bluffing? Daniel asked. No, she said. But I think he's baiting us. Baiting us how? Think about it, Melanie said. He just told us where the documents are. But he didn't say what's in them. Didn't say what they unlock. Daniel glanced at her. You think it's a trick? I think it's a test, she replied. But we're going to pass it, our way. Back in his apartment, George sat with the empty wall safe open. The bundles inside were fake. High-quality replicas, crafted years ago for a different purpose. He had kept them hidden for so long, he forgot they even existed. Until now. He closed the safe. The real money, the true wealth, was already gone. Scattered across multiple accounts. Locked under trusts. Hidden in plain sight. The legacy was secure. But this? This was theater. A necessary illusion. He had shown them just enough. Enough to make them greedy. Enough to draw out their next move. Because George didn't want an apology. He didn't want them to love him. He wanted the truth. And people, he'd learned, only reveal their true selves when they think they've already won. The very next morning, Daniel stood at the bank before the doors even opened. He wore a charcoal blazer and carried a sleek leather folder under his arm. To anyone watching, he looked like a man on important business. And he was. Just not his own. As soon as the teller unlocked the glass doors at 9:01 a.m., Daniel stepped inside and flashed the brass key his father had handed him the night before. Safe deposit access, he said, voice controlled. Under the name George Callahan. The woman behind the counter typed into her computer, then nodded politely. Follow me. Daniel followed her past a short corridor into a room lined with narrow metal lockers. The woman unlocked one of them and stepped aside. Daniel reached in, and there it was. A thick manila envelope, sealed. He took it with shaking hands and left the bank in silence. By noon, he was back home, standing over the kitchen table while Melanie hovered behind him. You open it, he said. Melanie didn't hesitate. She tore the flap and pulled out a letter first. Daniel unfolded it. It read. Daniel. If you're reading this, then you've chosen to follow the thread I left you. That's good. But this isn't a reward, it's a mirror. What's inside this envelope isn't money. It's my story. My records. The truth behind everything you never asked about. You always thought I lived small because I didn't have the means. But I lived this way by choice. Because I watched people lose their soul chasing more. I want to know who you really are. If you're reading this only to count what's left for you, then you already have your answer. Dad. Melanie scowled. It's a lecture. Daniel flipped through the rest of the contents. Inside were legal documents. Old savings bonds. Property titles. Donation agreements. A list of charities. Even a handwritten will, not notarized, just scrawled with intent. Nowhere did it say you will inherit. Nowhere did it mention amounts. No trusts. No account numbers. No promises. Melanie's voice was sharp now. He's playing games. Daniel sat down, silent. Melanie grabbed the envelope again. Inside was one final sheet. Typed. Neat. It was a quote from Evelyn, his mother. We give because we can. Not because we're asked. And we love because it's right. Not because it's owed. Melanie's jaw clenched. I've had enough of this. Daniel looked up. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we stop waiting for breadcrumbs, she said. He has more. And if he won't come forward with it, then we make him. Daniel frowned. How? Melanie picked up her phone. I'm calling Uncle Greg. Daniel's eyes widened. The lawyer? She nodded. George is vulnerable. Elderly. Acting erratic. We can build a case that he's unfit to manage his own estate. Daniel stood up. Melanie, no. That's crossing a line. She snapped. He gave us a fake stack of cash and a letter filled with guilt. He's testing us like we're criminals. I'm not going to sit here while he plays king of nothing. Daniel said nothing. Because part of him agreed. And part of him was scared. 2 days later, George received a knock at the door. Not Daniel. Not Melanie. A courier. He signed for the envelope and closed the door. Inside was a legal document. A draft of a proposed financial guardianship agreement. Power of attorney. Full control over all assets. Requested by Daniel Callahan and Melanie Callahan. George sat at the table and read every word. Not with anger. Not with sadness. But with something far quieter. Resolve. So this was it. Their final play. No more fake pleasantries. No more games. Now it was law. Control. An attempt to take his legacy through paperwork. He smiled. They had just handed him exactly what he needed. The next day, Daniel received a call from his father. Come over, George said. Bring the papers. Daniel paused. You got them? Yes, George replied calmly. I'd like to talk in person. One last time. When Daniel and Melanie arrived, George had already set the table. Not with food. With paper. 3 copies of the guardianship contract sat neatly, side by side. Melanie tried to speak first, but George held up his hand. No pleasantries, he said. You want control. You're going to explain why. Daniel sat slowly. Dad, you've been under a lot of stress lately. And we just thought. Speak the truth, George interrupted. For once. Daniel hesitated. We're concerned. Melanie cut in. You've shown signs of confusion. You keep changing your plans. You're hiding things. That's not safe, for you or for your estate. George looked at her coldly. You searched my room. She blinked. I was trying to help. George turned to Daniel. And you forged this contract behind my back. Daniel looked away. George picked up one of the documents and held it between his fingers like a napkin. Then he ripped it in half. The sound cut through the air. You think you're going to take what I built with my blood, George said, with a signature? Melanie's voice rose. You're being unreasonable. George stood up. You insulted my home. Mocked my life. Dug through my bedroom. And now you're here with a pen in your hand asking me to hand over everything. Daniel stood too. Dad, calm down. George's voice dropped to a whisper. I've never been calmer. He pulled something from the shelf behind him. A small black box. He opened it. Inside was a voice recorder. He pressed play. Melanie's voice echoed through the room. He's hiding something. We have to go back. Then Daniel's voice. When he pulled out that stack from the wall, he was too calm. He's hiding something big. Melanie again. We'll visit again. Play nice. Figure out how much there really is. Then silence. Then George. I planted that in the hallway 2 weeks ago. I heard everything. Daniel went pale. Melanie looked like she'd swallowed glass. I wanted to believe there was a part of you left that still saw me as your father, George said. Not as a vault. But I was wrong. He closed the recorder and placed it in the box. Then he took a second folder from the table. This, he said, is the real contract. He slid it across to Daniel. Daniel opened it. His face fell. Inside was a signed, notarized document. George Callahan's final will and testament. It outlined a $1 million trust for a scholarship fund in Evelyn's name. Ownership of George's apartment and pension to a local veterans center. And Daniel? Daniel would receive one item. A letter. Nothing more. Melanie's name wasn't mentioned once. Daniel looked up. You're cutting me out? George stared at him. I'm setting you free. From the illusion that you deserve what you never valued. Melanie stood. You can't do this. I already have, George said. As they left, defeated, Melanie's voice hissed through the hallway. We'll contest this. We'll take you to court. George didn't respond. He closed the door. Locked it. Then turned to the photo of Evelyn. He smiled. You told me not to raise him to be greedy, he whispered. I tried. And now? I've done my part. George expected silence after they left. But instead, it came fast. 2 days later, he got a notice in the mail. Daniel had formally challenged the will through a probate attorney. A claim of mental incompetence. George was not of sound mind. Easily manipulated. Vulnerable. He read the letter twice. Then once more. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he couldn't believe how quickly Daniel had gone from greedy to ruthless. They weren't going to walk away quietly. They were going to drag him through the mud if it meant getting their hands on what he'd spent a lifetime building. That evening, George sat in his recliner, the letter resting on his lap like a weight. He stared at the floor. But not because he was afraid. No. He was thinking. Planning. When you've scrubbed blood off hospital floors and worked 17-hour days without a lunch break, you learn how to hold your ground. They wanted a war? Then he'd give them one. But it wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet. Measured. And devastating. The next morning, George mailed 2 packages. One to Claire Richards, his estate lawyer. The other, to Jacob Monroe, an old friend of Evelyn's, a retired journalist and now a modest blogger who still believed in truth over spin. Inside both packages was the same item. The voice recording. On Saturday, Claire filed an official response to the probate challenge. She included a notarized psychological assessment, signed by a licensed physician, dated just 1 month prior. George had passed with full marks. Mental clarity. Lucid memory. High cognitive function. But more importantly, she included the recording. Claire knew how to use the legal system. But Jacob? He knew how to use a headline. By Monday morning, the article was live. He lived like a janitor, but had $8 million from his greedy son. An elderly man in Queens is teaching his son the most expensive lesson of his life. The story exploded. Not on national news, but on local channels, family forums, Reddit, Facebook. The headline went viral. People began to share it. I hope I have this kind of strength at 75. This broke my heart. The quiet dignity in this man's choices. My dad worked 2 jobs like this. We never appreciated him either. The son deserves nothing. Daniel's name wasn't mentioned, but the quotes in the recording made it unmistakably real. People heard him say it. He probably thinks a microwave is still luxury. We'll visit again. Play nice. We can get power of attorney. The comments section turned into a courtroom. And Daniel lost, publicly. Melanie's business account on Instagram dropped 14,000 followers in a week. Their names were now associated with betrayal, greed, arrogance. And George? He didn't say a word. He just sat in his apartment and let the storm swirl outside. A week later, Daniel came alone. No Melanie. His knock was softer this time. More hesitant. George opened the door slowly. Daniel stood there, no blazer, no watch, no confidence. Just a man whose image had collapsed. Can I come in? He asked. George didn't answer. He stepped aside. Daniel sat on the couch. Hands folded. Not fidgeting. Just still. I didn't know about the article, he said after a moment. Not until it was everywhere. George sat in his chair, eyes quiet. Was anything in it untrue? Daniel looked away. No. George waited. Daniel finally continued, voice lower. I didn't plan to fight you. Melanie, she pushed. I agreed. I was angry. Embarrassed. I thought. He stopped. What did you think? George asked. Daniel's voice cracked. I thought, maybe you didn't love me anymore. George blinked. And for the first time in months, his heart shifted. Just slightly. He didn't speak. So Daniel kept going. You were always strong. And I thought I had to be stronger. Flashier. More successful. I thought, if I became more than you, I'd earn your approval. But I forgot what you gave up to get me here. George let the silence stretch long. Then he stood. He walked to the shelf and pulled down a small photo frame. It was Daniel, aged 6, asleep on George's chest. Evelyn had taken it on a cold December night after a long shift. George handed it to him. I never stopped loving you, he said. But I stopped trusting who you became. Daniel looked at the photo, and for a second, George saw a flicker, something honest. Not guilt. Not manipulation. But regret. Real regret. Can I earn it back? Daniel asked quietly. George didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't know yet. That night, George added a new note to his will. A clause. If Daniel shows evidence of long-term care and personal growth, the executor has the right to restore a portion of the estate to him. But only if he never asks for it. He signed it. Then placed it in the black folder, tucked neatly behind Evelyn's letter. Because forgiveness, George believed, had to be earned in silence, not begged for in desperation. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence after Daniel came alone, broken. George thought maybe, just maybe, that would be the end of it. That he'd finally get to breathe. That perhaps the worst of the storm had passed, and whatever came next would arrive quietly, humbly, like Daniel did that evening, with open hands and lowered eyes. But then she came back. Not with softness. Not with remorse. She came back with fire. Melanie. Standing at his door again. This time alone. This time angry. This time dangerous. George opened the door slowly. She didn't even wait to be invited in. She pushed past him with her heels clicking like a gavel on his old wood floor. I hope you're proud of yourself, she snapped. George closed the door behind her. I am. Melanie turned, her face red. You humiliated us. You let that disgusting recording go viral. You've ruined our names, our business. I didn't leak it, George said calmly. I simply mailed it to a friend. What happened after that? I suppose that's what people call karma. Melanie scoffed. You're a coward. You couldn't face us directly, so you turned the world against us? George walked to his chair and sat down slowly, knees aching. You came into my home. Mocked my life. Dug through my belongings. Tried to steal control of my estate behind my back. I was protecting Daniel's future, she spat. You were protecting your lifestyle, he said. And the difference between those two things is what separates a partner from a parasite. Her eyes flared. You think you've won, she hissed. You think this little apartment and your sad little pile of cash make you noble? George looked at her, tired but clear. No, he said. But the way I earned it makes me proud. And the way you tried to take it? That makes you irrelevant. She took a step toward him. You listen to me, you bitter old man. You may have the money now, but you're on borrowed time. People like you always die alone. And when you do, someone like me will make sure your name is buried with you. George looked at her, long and hard. And then, without a word, he reached down and pulled out a small envelope from the side table. He slid it across the table toward her. She looked at it, confused. What's this? He said nothing. Just waited. She opened it. Inside, a copy of the updated will clause. The new condition. The line that read. If Daniel shows evidence of long-term care and personal growth, the executor has the right to restore a portion of the estate to him. But only if he never asks for it. And only if he is no longer legally or personally tied to Melanie Blake Callahan. She stared at it for a long time. George spoke quietly. I'm not giving Daniel anything until he grows. Until he learns to love without greed. And I'll never reward someone who uses love as leverage. Melanie's voice cracked. You'd cut your own son off just to punish me? George stood now, slowly but surely. No, he said. I'd protect him from the one person in his life who only sees him as a step toward a bigger paycheck. She froze. And for the first time, she had no comeback. No performance. Just stunned, seething silence. He walked to the door and opened it. Melanie stood there for another second, lips trembling. You're cruel, she finally whispered. George replied. No. I'm free. She left without another word. The door closed behind her. And George, for the first time in years, locked it with a calm heart. The next day, Daniel returned. Not for answers. Not for money. Just to sit. He helped George move the recliner to the window so they could both watch the city together. No words were exchanged for 20 minutes. And then Daniel said, quietly. She's gone. George nodded. I saw. Daniel looked down. I lost everything. George turned. No, he said. You just found your chance to earn it back. Daniel's voice cracked. I don't deserve it. George smiled, faint but real. Now you're starting to understand. Later that night, George updated the will again. Not to promise anything. But to open a door. If Daniel continues to show growth, true growth, and lives a life of purpose, not performance, he may one day receive what was once his. But not as an inheritance. As a reflection of the man he chose to become. Then he put the papers away. And turned off the lights. Not with sadness. Not with fear. But with peace. Because they had both left. But only one of them had left with empty hands. The other still had time. Fall came quietly. The leaves along George's street had begun to turn amber, gold, rust red, and the air tasted faintly of coming rain and cold. George had always loved October. Evelyn used to call it the honest season. The time of year when everything sheds its mask and shows you its true colors. He thought about that as he sat by the window, wrapped in an old gray sweater, watching the wind nudge the branches outside. It had been a month since Melanie slammed the door behind her. A month since Daniel walked in without her and sat silently across from him. A month of small visits. No requests. No manipulation. Just presence. Sometimes Daniel would come and read aloud from Evelyn's favorite books. Sometimes they would sit in silence, watching the pigeons on the fire escape. Once, Daniel brought an old childhood photo of himself and Evelyn. He didn't say anything. He just placed it on the table and went to make tea. George noticed it every day. He hadn't spoken about the money again. He hadn't mentioned the will. Not even once. And George noticed that too. One Saturday morning, Daniel knocked again. He was dressed simply, sneakers, a flannel shirt, a slightly wrinkled jacket. There was no car key hanging from his fingers. No cologne. Just him. George opened the door, expecting the usual quiet exchange. But Daniel was holding something. A small wooden box. Handcrafted. Old. It took George a moment to recognize it. His toolbox. The one from his hospital janitor job, nearly 35 years ago. "I found this in the garage," Daniel said. "At the old place. I thought it was gone." George took it carefully, his fingers brushing over the scuffed surface. "I use this every night," he murmured. "Fixed pipes, hinges, broken cafeteria tables." He opened it. Inside, neatly laid out, were the tools he hadn't seen in decades, worn, rusted, but still whole. Daniel looked down. "I wanted to bring you something that reminded you of how it all started." George looked up, eyes softer than they had been in a long time. "I never forgot." "I did," Daniel said quietly. "But I'm trying to remember now." George motioned for him to come in. They sat together, the toolbox open between them. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. Because sometimes silence isn't distance. Sometimes it's healing. The next week, Daniel returned with something else. A journal. Brown leather. Slightly frayed at the edges. He handed it to George. "I've been writing. About her. About you. About everything I never said." George opened it and scanned the first page. "I spent years trying to be impressive, not understanding that the man who built my life never needed applause. He just needed to be seen." George closed the book gently. "Have you been showing this to anyone?" he asked. "No," Daniel said. "Just you." George stood up slowly and walked to the shelf. He pulled out the black folder, his final will and testament. He held it for a long time. Then he looked at Daniel. "You're not getting this." Daniel looked confused. "I'm not asking." George smiled faintly. "Let me finish." He placed the black folder back on the shelf. Then walked into his bedroom and returned with a white envelope. Smaller. Lighter. He handed it to Daniel. Daniel opened it. Inside, a new document. A quiet amendment. Daniel Callahan is to receive a portion of the estate, 25%, to be held in a restricted account, to be unlocked only after a full year of continued work in community service or nonprofit labor. The remainder to follow over time, contingent on character, not condition. Daniel looked up. "I don't need this," he said, voice tight. "I just want to be here. I just want to fix what I broke." "I know," George said. "And that's why I'm giving it to you." Daniel swallowed hard. "I'll earn it," he said. George nodded. "I believe you will." That night, they ate together. Not takeout. Not microwave meals. Daniel cooked George's old stew recipe, written in Evelyn's handwriting on a yellowing index card. It was too salty. The potatoes were undercooked. But George ate every bite. And smiled. Because it was the first time in years that someone cooked for him not out of guilt, but out of love. Winter arrived. The wind grew sharper. The nights longer. But inside that small apartment, warmth returned. Daniel came every Saturday. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes with old photographs. Sometimes with nothing but a quiet apology in his eyes. One day, he brought Evelyn's ring. He placed it in George's palm and said, "It belongs here. Not in a box. Not on anyone's finger but yours." George didn't speak. He just closed his hand around it and let the memories come. In February, Daniel showed George the website he'd been building. A scholarship fund. The Evelyn Callahan Foundation. For single parents. For working-class kids. For people like George had once been. "I started it with my own savings," Daniel said. "Just a small fund. But I want to grow it. Slowly. Honestly." George looked at the homepage. A photo of Evelyn. Her smile captured mid-laugh. Beneath it, the quote she always said. "We give because we can. Not because we're asked." George felt his throat tighten. For the first time in years, he let a tear fall. Not out of grief. But out of relief. Because his story was not ending in bitterness. It was blooming into something lasting. Spring came. The sun warmed the city again. One morning, George sat by the window, sipping coffee, the birds loud outside. Daniel entered with 2 cups in hand. And for the first time, George said, "I'm glad you came." Daniel smiled. "I'm glad you waited for me to come back." Final words. George Callahan never moved out of that apartment. He didn't buy a mansion. Didn't flaunt the money. But he gave. To the hospital where he'd once mopped floors. To the school where Daniel learned to read. To the food bank Evelyn used to volunteer at. And in the end, his legacy wasn't in the millions. It was in the man Daniel finally became. The man who returned without a plan to take, but simply to remember. Because sometimes, the richest people live in the smallest apartments. And carry the heaviest love in the quietest ways.